what a wonderful world.
Welcome to See and Learn on Saba 2013. The second half of October once again saw a See and Learn calendar packed full of events, presentations, field trips, and kids' after-school activities. We'll start this report with a familiar face on Saba, geomorphologist Jennifer Rahn. As a coastal specialist, Jennifer has been looking at the problems and potential solutions for the tent reef fill issue.
Today we were working with students from the Second Chance program and the Organoponics farm. We were surveying and trying to get an estimate of the volume of the fill that's on tent reef. For the remediation, we're going to move it further down the beach to a safer area so where it won't affect the reefs. And the students were helping me take those measurements along the top of the fill and along the slope of the fill, which is very steep, so it was a little hazardous and interesting today to get those measurements. The problem is that the large volume of sediment that's there is not naturally occurring. There's been about 3,000 truckloads of this fill dumped, and it's a very fine sediment. We call it clay when we're defining it as a soil type, and that clay, once it gets into the water column, will stay suspended for long periods of time. So the suspended sediment on the corals adds additional stress to them. They're already experienced things from increased water temperatures and a variety of other environmental factors. So this is just one more stressor on the corals, which does not help them. So we're trying to move this sediment away from the shore. It's 3 meters away from the ocean right now, where large waves, especially during hurricanes or something, could pick up the sediment and take it and put it on tent reef. The fill eventually will be moved further down on tent reef to a higher elevation. Not all the fill will be moved. Some of it will be left there and it'll be stabilized with terracing and rocks. Large majority of it will be moved further down, and there's some ideas to make that a recreational area. It will be stabilized with rocks and terracing and some nice indigenous plants. We're working with Otto at the Organoponics farm to figure out what the best plant species would be to remediate that area that would naturally grow in that type of very dry environment very close to the shoreline.
Fish and fishery expert Martin DeGraff, who is currently working on the Saba Bank Management Program, met up with our See and Learn intern Imke to discuss his Conch research.
In your See and Learn presentation, you talked about the Conch research you've been doing on Saba and on Statia. Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, there's several ways how conch is fished in the Caribbean and on the Saba Bank. Usually conch can occur in very, very shallow water, like up to 30-40 centimeters deep, so they can just be literally picked off sandy beds. Snorkeling, free diving is a common way of catching them. Traditionally, actually, the conch has always been harvested in the shallow water populations, and the deep water populations were always left alone. But what you see in many areas where the conch and the shallow water populations pretty much have been fished or fished out, is that fishermen have to move to conch populations 20, 30, 40 meters deep. Now that's not going to work again with free diving. So of course with scuba, conch is harvested. Another technique that they use is hookah diving, where you have sort of a mother boat with many hoses going off the boat with divers on each hose, and they sort of walk or swim over the bottom, collecting the conch and bringing it back up to the surface.
What are the regulations of the size of the conch?
One of the common regulations to protect conch has actually to do with the length of the shell. The idea is to protect the juveniles, so only the adults are harvested. Unfortunately, with conch, they grow a little bit differently. They grow first in length, and then they grow in width. What you see here is two conch that are, technically speaking, of a legal size. They're both over 18 centimeters, but as you can see, they look very different. This is actually a juvenile or immature conch. You can recognize it by the thickness of its shell here. It's very, very thin, and it's not flared. If you compare this shell with this one here, you see that the lip is flared, and you see it's quite thick. Now both are 18 centimeters, so technically speaking it's legal to harvest either one of them. But as you can see, not both of them are mature. So a lip shell length is actually a poor regulation to determine maturity in a conch. So what you see now that is slowly changing in most regulations, and what should also change around Saba and Statia, is that you shouldn't check for length for the maturity, but you have to look at the thickness of the lip. Some research conducted on other islands have actually proven that when the thickness of the lip is around 2 centimeters thick, that's when the animal is mature. So a much more efficient regulation is to put in place that you're not allowed to harvest conch with a lip thickness smaller than 2 centimeters.
Is there a healthy queen conch population around the island?
We know that the Saba Bank used to have a large amount of conch. Up to the early 1990s, the Saba Bank was heavily fished by fishermen from many different islands with diving gear, hookah setups. The story goes that in the mid-1990s, actually, in 2 containers of illegally harvested conch meat were confiscated by the customs in St. Martin, and that was pretty much the signal for the Coast Guard to actually sweep the Saba Bank clean of foreign fishing vessels. So pretty much since the mid-1990s, the Saba Bank has been cleaned from fishermen from other islands, and only the Saba fishermen fish there. But also since the mid-1990s, there hasn't been any conch fishery on the Saba Bank. And actually since, again, the beginning of the 1990s, nobody has looked at the conch. So we have no idea at the moment whether the conch have come back to numbers that might be able to open up a legal fishery again. So as in Statia, the aim for the Saba Bank is that, especially we started already, but next year there will be more emphasis on it, that next year we will use video systems, towed video systems, to try to literally count the conch and make a sort of a population estimate for the Saba Bank. Again, with the idea whether or not it's possible to open up a small-scale legal fishery again on the Saba Bank. So it's not going to happen quick. I hope that hopefully this decision can be made maybe mid-2015, that we are sort of a little bit more aware of what's going on with regards to conch on the Saba Bank. I know that some of the fishermen are interested. It's also nice that usually when you do research, quite often it leads to restrictions, and it sort of frustrates fishermen. So it's actually nice if you could actually do some research that might actually provide an opportunity for fishermen in the future. So I'm actually quite keen on this work, because I'm quite hopeful. I can't guarantee it, but I'm quite hopeful that actually the conch has returned to the Saba Bank and might be again an opportunity for local fishermen and local economy.
Open ocean researcher Sanke Janssen gave See and Learn presentations on jellyfish and the wonders of the deep. Here he explains his research into camouflage and vision and how it can be put to practical use.
So humans can use camouflage for a number of different purposes, but one of the ways that we look at it is how it can affect commercial fishing. So in commercial fishing, you want to catch certain species of fish, and you really do not want to catch other species. And in particular, you don't want to catch species that are endangered. So a good example of this are long line fisheries, where they have very long lines with multiple hooks on them that are usually there to catch large billfish, things like swordfish, things of that sort, tuna in some cases. And then they don't want to catch sea turtles. But the problem is that sea turtles are just as interested in the lures as any other animal, and they will bite onto the hooks, and then they will suffocate and drown before the line is actually brought back in. And so we actually had a project where we looked at how we could create lures that would attract one animal and not attract another. And we call this selective invisibility, sort of taking advantage of the ideas of camouflage to serve an environmental purpose. So there are a number of different ways you can do this, because vision between animals varies in a couple different ways. One is color. Some animals can see certain colors, other animals can't. A good example of this is that most insects cannot see red, but we see red very well. Your dog and your cat actually cannot see red very well at all, but we can. In the case of swordfish and sea turtles, there's an interesting thing that swordfish cannot see ultraviolet light, just like we cannot. But the sea turtles can. And so you can actually go in the opposite direction. Instead of creating a lure, you can create a deterrent. It turns out that sea turtles will avoid models of sharks, even if they're pretty small. And so we created transparent shark models that would still block UV light, and so they would block black to any animal that could see UV. And that way we could put them outside of places where we did not want turtles to go. In one example, we put them in the inlets to nuclear power plants. And then the turtle would show up, they would see a big black shark, other animals wouldn't, and then they would move away from this. So that's one way you can use color to allow one animal to see something and another not. Another way you can do this is to take advantage of the fact that animals have very different levels of visual acuity, meaning some animals have very sharp vision and some animals have very poor vision. Humans have very, very sharp vision. For example, I can look up at Mount Scenery there and see every little girder on the cell phone tower. But something like a crab could barely make out the details of your face at all. Most animals, to our eyes, would be what we would call legally blind. They see very, very poorly as far as detail goes. And so you can create lures that have lots of very fine patterns that one animal can see and another cannot. So for example, swordfish have really big, sharp eyes. And so you could create a patterned lure that they see very nicely, but you can choose the colors of that pattern so that when they blend together, for an animal like a sea turtle that has much less sharp vision, those colors blend so that they look just like the background. And so it's invisible to the turtle, but completely visible to the swordfish that you want. The final thing you can take advantage of is that animals have very different speeds of vision, sort of like the shutter speed on a camera. For example, cats have very fast vision. And so when they're looking at a television set, they don't see people moving around and walking like we do. Instead, what they see is what a TV is really putting out, which is an image that's flashing about 60 times a second. And it looks like this crazy flashing display to them, and that's why they're so mesmerized by it. And animals have different speeds of this sort, also in the ocean. And so in this particular case, it turns out that the biggest difference between swordfish and sea turtles is that sea turtles have very slow vision. And so we can also create lures that have little lights, little LEDs, that blink back and forth between two different colors. And the animals that can see those flashes going at that speed see a wonderfully attractive lure. It looks like a little bioluminescent animal that they might want to feed on. But for those that can't separate them because it's too quickly, we choose colors of LEDs so that when you mash those two colors together, again, it looks just like the background and they can't see it. So those are three different ways that you can create a lure or a deterrent that one animal can see but another can't, so that we can catch the fish we want and not harm the endangered species that we're trying to protect.
One of the favorite subjects with See and Learn followers over the years has been orchids. So for 2013, expert Jim Ackerman from the University of Puerto Rico came to Saba to conduct some more research.
Well, orchids are important for Saba because we can use them as marquee species. Since the average person doesn't pay much attention to their plants that are around their neighborhood unless they're producing mangoes or passion fruit or something like that. When you mention orchids, people pay attention because pretty much everybody likes orchids, and why they like orchids, I have no idea, but that's the way it is worldwide. So with orchids, we can use that as a means of drawing attention to the vegetation of Saba.
And now the number of poop pellets. This is the fun part.
Around this area?
Around this area. And we're doing the same.
I really like to engage people, whether they are scientists or students or just people off the streets in the kinds of things that I do. It helps me with my work because we went out to actually do some science, which will eventually end up in the scientific literature. But it also helps people open their eyes to what's around them. So we got a nice group to go down, and the whole idea was to look at one species of orchid. It's called Brassavola cuculatan. This is a species that is, I wouldn't say common in Saba, but it is a conspicuous, and in my personal opinion, I think it's one of the most beautiful orchids in the Caribbean. And the whole idea is to see how the population health is doing and whether the plants are reproducing and the populations are stable, or whether the plants are on a decline. And this might be related to the habitat in which they are in, and they seem to be heavily occupied by goats. So we have seen some evidence that the plants have been munched on. You can see the leaves, and some of the leaves are just like cut off. And so we wanted to find out the frequency of goats in the area, and I mean, we're not going to sit around and look for goats. So instead, what we did was we counted goat pellets, and that they're very distinctive. And the more goat pellets that are around the orchids, the more goats that were probably in the neighborhood. And we can associate that with the amount of herbivory, how many plants have been eaten, how much of the plants have been eaten, and how high the plants are up on the trees, whether that makes a difference. So all of these factors will be used to determine whether the goats make a difference to the population health of Brassavola cucullata. They may make a difference, and on the other hand, they may not. So this is something that we want to find out.
Most of us take the night sky for granted, but for astronomer Stephen Martin, it is more than just stars and planets. He expands upon the problems with light pollution.
Well, it's not fully understood all the adverse effects. We know that migrating animals on land, sea, and air use the stars, the sun, the moon to navigate. And so too much light disrupts their navigation, disrupts bird migrations, disrupts whale migrations, disrupts sea turtle migrations. Also, there are some animals and species that require absolute darkness. And so when there's too much artificial light, it disrupts their natural cycles. It affects mating, it affects populations. It even affects plants. Plants need a day-night cycle, just like everything else does. So we're still just in the beginning stages of starting to understand what light pollution does to the environment, but we do know it has adverse effects. And so it's important to preserve the night sky as much as possible in as many places as possible. We're here with the students tonight doing an international study on light pollution. What the students will be doing is making measurements of the night sky from different positions on Saba, and they'll contribute that to an international effort to study night pollution around the world. So Saba will make a contribution to science that will be seen internationally, and students in high school will make a contribution. We protect the air, we protect the water, we protect the land. Why shouldn't we protect the night sky? It's part of our environment, and disruptions to the natural day-night cycle have adverse effects on animals, migrating sea turtles, among other life, as well as humans. And so there's many reasons to preserve the night sky, not just for ourselves and future generations, but there's health and environmental and economic benefits as well.
With the increase in sightings of humpback whales in the Saba territorial waters, See and Learn brought in from the Dominican Republic whale watching expert Tom Conlon to advise us on how best to share the environment with these gentle giants.
Well, it seems to me that Saba is in a unique area where it's towards the very end of the migration route for mating and calvings of humpback whales. And from that, it seems that there's more and more whales coming by Saba every year. And with that, you're going to find interest with clients, divers, tourists, to try to interact with those whales. And it's real important that if you do try to work whales here, okay, and get close to them, that you do it in a real passive way. Are really coming down to the Caribbean. And they'll keep returning to those areas. So I can see how whales cross through here. I thought it was very important to get the local dive operators together, or any people who are interested in whales just in general, locals who have their own boats, fishermen who go out to Saba Bank, which is an area that could someday become a mating and calving ground for whales, depending on how they move around. To discuss the proper way to approach whales. It isn't something that you can just zip up behind them really quickly and throw people in the water, or just, you don't want to harass them. You want them to feel comfortable in the area. You want them to feel safe. They're smart. If they don't want to be around you, they're not going to be around you. the whole idea is to safely approach the whales. And I mean that for the whale's sake, not for the boat's sake, okay? Because we need to be careful that we don't do anything to really disturb what the whale may be doing there. If it's with a mother and calf, if it's a mother calf that you find, you know, you got to build the confidence of that mother that you're not going to hurt her calf. They do care about each other. I don't care what anybody says. They have feelings, okay, in their own way. And you have the possibilities here with the changing environment and the noise that is that whales are encountering now, especially up in the other mating and calving grounds north of here, with cruise ships and things like that. With Saba Bank, it's kind of the perfect place, or the type of place that humpback whales like. It's shallow, meaning 40 feet to 100 feet. They're coastal animals, so they like that depth. It's big. It's away from a lot of traffic. And it's, again, you have the primary mating and calving grounds up the Dominican Republic area. They come into the Virgin Islands, which are only 90 miles from here. So I can see you getting fall off from that, as well as, you know, hearing the song probably more so than witnessing a whale in the area, because of how far the sound will travel depending on their depth. And then south of here you have Beckway, which has about 300 whales a year that go down there to mate and calve. So you're getting some cross migration here from somewhere, and it seems to be increasing from the way I understand it.
New to See and Learn on Saba this year is the Youth Environmental Leadership Program known as YELP. The main goal of the program is to get local kids involved in environmental sciences. Here is Seabird McEwen from the Smithsonian Institution in action with the YELP team.
Today we're taking the YELP kids down to the tide pools to practice a little scientific methodology. So we were looking at how you can actually test ecological questions. And so we chose to look at littorine snails in the high and low positions on the pool walls, and started asking some questions about what that meant and how you can actually get at some of the answers that you might be missing. Early exposure is always important for environmental awareness, and it's true that we conserve what we love. And the best way to get people to love things is to get them out and exposed early. And these kids have been fantastic. They're definitely fully engaged in their environment and enjoying themselves, as well as learning something valuable.
As we close out the 11th season of See and Learn on Saba, I'd like to thank all the sponsors, teachers, scientists, and especially the community of Saba for coming together and helping us make this program a continuing success. I hope See and Learn has reinforced that Saba's environment is a precious resource that we must nurture for future generations.
I think to myself, what a wonderful